Thanks. Hello, can you hear me? Oh, a little feedback. Welcome to the last artist lecture of winter quarter. That means there'll be more next quarter. So, hi, I'm Evan Blackwell. I'm here to introduce the introductions. And so let's get this party started. I welcome you all. We ask that you please turn off your digital technology. Please turn your ringers off. We put it on airplane mode. We don't need the surveillance. Is that okay? And then there's, it seems like at times, especially when we get closer to spring, that everything happens at once. So this is one of those days where there's a lot of great lectures going on. There's a lot of great events going on. And besides being here, after this at 1 o'clock, there's a celebration for Black History Month in the library building from 1 to 4. That's sponsored by the First Peoples Multicultural, Trans, and Queer Support Services Center. So please, and that's going from 1 to 4, so you can go right at the start or jump in. And then after that, Michelle Pope's here to talk about what's the exciting events that are happening at the Evergreen Gallery. And then after Michelle makes an announcement, Arun's gonna introduce Anne. So thank you all. Michelle Pope.
Thanks. Okay. Hi, everyone. Oh, wow, it's dark in here now. I just want to make a really quick, brief announcement to remind everybody to please attend the reception tonight, the opening reception for the show, the gallery show that we put on in the library gallery. It's called Retrospective, and it's been a long few weeks to get this work up, but we're super excited about it. We've got 85 pieces of artwork that we have hung on the walls, as well as a handful of sculptures. It's from our original, the original Evergreen art collection. Part of what we've discovered as we've uncovered this work is that there's a whole series of other collections of artwork kind of in various places on campus, so we're going to speak about that in the show. We have so much amazing artwork that we actually have here on our campus, and we were really fortunate to bring some of that up out of our basement. Literally, some of it is from the very, very beginning of the college, so 49 years ago. Our first collection started, a printmaking collection. So there's some really dated works, and I mean that in many ways. There's some really interesting work, and a lot of conversations are going to come up about representation and appropriation, and what does permanent mean, and what does conservation mean, because some of this works, you can see little hints of water damage and stuff. So, and it's just weird and eclectic. One of the original artists from a residency from 1976, Frank Samuelson, is actually going to be in attendance tonight. So we're really excited to have him here. So please come, because myself and a handful of students have put a ton of work into this, so we're really proud of it, and we want to share that with everybody. So I wanted to mention that, and then I also just want to mention again, and I don't have a lot of other information about this yet, but I just want to remind seniors in the room that we are going to have a spring show the month right around graduation. We are still working out the criteria for that. We are going to have a series of workshops. I believe the first one is going to be an eval week, early eval week. Yes? Okay. So we will send out a mass email and information from the various faculty. We'll make sure that information gets to you, but if you are a senior, or going to be a senior, or graduating this spring, please be thinking about if you want to apply for this opportunity to have your work featured in the Evergreen Gallery. It's a real great opportunity to really put your work on display. So that's it. Please come tonight, 5 to 7. I'm out. I wish I could stay, but I have to go hang art. So thanks. Okay.
I'm Arun Chandra, faculty here at Evergreen, and Anne Warde and I were grad students at the University of Illinois some 20, 30 years ago. So I've known about her work for a long time. And what I'd like to give is a brief description of the historical context in which Anne is making her experiments, and other people are also making some experiments with that. So the final piece that we'll perform for you, this will be performed with the Evergreen Experimental Music Ensemble at the end, involves live instrumentalists being recorded and manipulated by computer programs that were written by Warde. And you'll hear that, and I'm sure she'll describe that further. But this idea of having a mechanical being, in this case the computer, of having something mechanical being able to respond to human activity is something that has intrigued composers and engineers and scientists for a long time. I'm sure you folks know of the experiments with trying to build a quote-unquote robot in the early 19th century, where they tried to have chess-playing things which were actually fakes. But they had this idea, what happens if something that's not human, something perhaps inanimate, comes to life, and then we can interact with it? So Mary Shelley's imagination, took that to a place where she invented something called Frankenstein and talked about this creation of something. And that was a big act of imagination, but it came from mythology that also involved things like the golem in certain traditions and other non-human beings interacting with humans. So this thing through the 19th century, through engineering and the development of technology since the Industrial Revolution, was still fascinating to people through the 19th century. But they found that they could not yet, at that time, build something that could respond and change its internal state because of what was coming into it. This kind of thing, which now is very common, every house that has a thermostat has such a thing. There you have a mechanism, that takes in information and then decides what to do in a very simple way with a thermostat, of whether to turn the heating on or leave it off or turn it off, So this is a kind of tiny robot that is able to respond through a feedback mechanism. And this notion of a feedback mechanism didn't come into being until the late 1940s, where in search, and this was all done for the military, they were trying to find ways that an anti-aircraft gun could shoot down an enemy plane. And this was a complicated thing because the information that came in and the positioning of the gun had to take into account what it thought was the speed of the gun and where it would be once the projectile, hopefully, according to them, hit the airplane, This required really the invention of what happens and how does one treat the notion of feedback. And this was also the time when cybernetics as a science came into being. As musicians, this was also fascinating, and the development of technology for musicians. So I'm talking about the late 40s for the development of cybernetics and the notion of feedback. And then in the 1950s, late 40s and 50s, electronics came into use by composers in Europe and in the United States. John Cage was one of the first people. He had an 8-channel concert done in, I think, 1951. And he was very interested also in what electronics can offer. There were other composers, Karlheinz Stockhausen in Germany. Our teacher, Herbert Brunn, was very much involved with that as well. He was a composer. So here, Cage in particular, through the 50s and 60s, was fascinated with technology in performance. So they would have lots of electronics, analog electronics, on stage with them when they were presenting things. This then gradually developed into using computers on stage. And with computers, the interest of composers came to be that, well, how can the computer be a partner in what I am doing as a composer? So already in the 1950s, Lejar and Hiller used the computer as a means for inventing compositions for string quartet. The first composition that exists is like that uses a computer for its composition. That's from 1956, I think. So this idea of how can the computer be a partner with the musicians was of interest very much since the 1970s. However, this notion of feedback mechanism was still being developed, and computers at that time were not fast enough to process what's coming in to change what might be going out. Since the early 1980s, this has been becoming more prominent, and composers were creating computer programs that could respond to events that they were picking up from their environment. And so there were a lot of things where there would be live computer accompaniment of musical ideas and done by performers. So performers would be playing, and then the computer would synthesize something that would be a response to those things. One of the things Anne has done that's, I think, remarkable is that she's expanded the notion of response and interaction. So in some ways, when you think of an interchange or an exchange of communication, that has to happen relatively soon. So I say something, Evan says something back to me, we have a conversation, etc. And that was a model of what the musician-computer interaction should be. Anne's done something else which I think is remarkable, which is the computer is here and creating things, but it's creating an environment. And the environment created by the computer is being affected by what the musicians do on stage, but it's not that typical kind of immediate feedback. Rather, the input from the musicians then becomes part of the oral environment created by the computer. And you know you're changing it, but you don't necessarily know how. Just like people, when they interact with each other, do change the environment in some sense, if we're sensitive to them, which I think we should be. But sometimes you don't know how they're changing the environment exactly. So I would like to introduce you to my friend, Dr. Anne Warde.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. It's nice to see Arun again after quite a while. I'm going to play just a tiny bit of a synthetic environment. Uh-oh. Okay. So this synthetic environment has one actual recorded element, which is the katydid insects. But when I went to use it in a musical composition, there were some questions about, well, you know, it's a nice recording and the katydid is making this nice sound, but there's all these cars, and, you know, you can kind of hear the highway, and there's this other kind of sound that doesn't really sound like it goes with the katydid, whatever that actually means, I'm not quite sure. So I said to myself, well, how about if I just cut out the katydid part and then make in the studio another environment out of percussion. I had a kind of a tambourine with little metal balls in it or something like that. So I made this sort of collection of sounds, and then I put them together, and then I mixed that with the sort of cleaned up katydid sound. So this was an idea of a kind of a synthetic environment. And what I'd like to do, since Arun was talking a little bit about history, is to briefly give you a little historical tour of what I've done with some specific ideas. And one is human-computer interaction and the notion of influence. So when Arun was describing what we'll do in this composition later on, to me, it's a notion of one system, one person, one group of people influencing another, and there is this kind of biological notion of symbiosis, and one of the kinds of symbiosis is mutualism, which is a mutually beneficial relationship that's created. So that's something that interests me. All of my work, especially right now, is really just trying to figure things out. So I'm in a kind of experimental mode. So these are the things I'd like to talk about and sort of focus on, is this notion of human-computer interaction that involves the notion of influence, and the notion of a synthetic environment, and also animal sounds. And that reason for the animal sounds will become clear, although they have been part of my experience as a composer and performer for quite a long time. So going back to some of my early work, I had a new and used music ensemble. That was the name of our ensemble, and it was with a flute player in the Buffalo Philharmonic, and we gave a number of concerts in Buffalo, and one of the pieces that we did was The Voice of the Whale by George Crumb, and I have a little piece of the score here. And a very interesting little part of my history is that this piece was inspired by the singing of the humpback whale, a recording of which the composer heard in 1969. That was a huge event when there was a recording distributed, I think, in National Geographic, which was one of the most listened to recordings in that era, because this is the first time that most people had really heard whale sound. So George Crumb made a piece for flute and piano and cello. So we performed that. So it was an early connection of music and animal sound for me. I lived also around that time, a little later, on a lake. And I had gotten a computer. This is one of the first kind of graphics computers. And so I attempted to use it, and I'm going to just play a small bit of this this video, if it will play. I think it will. Does it play? Wait a minute. Okay, that should do. We just need to wait a minute. Yes, come on. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Okay, well, then maybe we will come back to that if we have time. What you heard at the beginning was this autumn song. And again, this was the synthetic environment that I talked about. So when I was at the University of Illinois, around the time that Arun was there, I started to be able to become a little bit more involved with the notion of human-computer interaction. And this was the first piece where I really thought carefully about this idea of influence. And I ended up thinking to myself, well, this isn't really just human-computer interaction, it's human-human-computer interaction. And this is a composition for two instruments that are part of the Javanese gamelan ensemble, which I was also very interested in at the time. And so this is for two players and a computer. And what the computer was doing was listening to how loud each of the players was playing, and then it was processing their sound at the same time. And when those, the combined loudness of the players reached a certain threshold, then the computer would change the way that it was processing the sound. But the players could control when that actually happened by either agreeing beforehand, okay, let's play really loud and then this will change pretty soon. Or one player could say, well, I don't really want it to change. And the other player would say, well, I really do want it to change. And so then they would sort of negotiate this kind of situation. So my sense was that the computer was setting up an environment that fostered certain kinds of interaction among the players. And I'll play you just a small piece of it. So this piece brings up another very interesting aspect that has been important in my compositional practice, and that is the difference between the experience of the composer, the experience of the performer, and the experience of the listener. And in this particular piece, the experience of the performer is quite different than the experience of the listener, because you don't really need to know that there's this whole kind of social thing going on with the players in order to appreciate the sounds of the piece. So that's something to keep in mind as we go ahead with some of the other works. So early in the 2000s, I began working at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I was there. I was working mostly with whale sounds and audio technology. We were trying to develop ways in which we could search through very long recordings, something people are doing quite a lot of now, to find sounds of interest in aid of conservation for different species. And at that time, I came into contact with Katie Payne and her husband, Roger Payne, and they were the ones who made the recordings that George Crumb listened to. So that was kind of a wonderful thing. And Katie Payne, then went on to also work with African forest elephants, and you'll see a little bit more about that. And then this is some of the other pieces that I'll talk about as I go ahead. This is one of my most favorite sounds that I encountered when I was at the Lab of Ornithology. This is a blue whale sound. The blue whales are the largest animals ever to have lived. And I'll play you a bit of this sound here that they make. Now that sound is speeded up 10 times. So this sound is the actual sound that you would hear. So it's a lot slower. And one thing that has been of interest to me recently is that the difference between what we just heard. So when we hear this very slow sound, as humans, we perceive it as these individual pulses. And when we heard the earlier version of it speeded up, it kind of coheres, and it sort of sounds like a shape, and it sort of, that's the rest of it. It sort of sounds like a shape that we can grab onto, and we kind of integrate it using our ears. So the question I've thought about, and this is not a question that we as biologists, bioacousticians, have been able to really address yet. But what does the whale hear? And how does the whale hear a kind of integrated sound that is integrating the sound over that that much longer period of time so that they roughly hear something like we heard when it was speeded up. And then if that is the case, then are they occupying time in a very different way than we as humans are? And in fact, that could be this case. I don't know at all, even to the extent that people have asked this question about whales, but they have asked the question about birds. And there is some evidence that birds are on the opposite end of the spectrum because they're making often quite fast sounds. And as humans, it's hard for us to tell, to hear all the individual sounds. And we could take a recording of a bird and slow it down, and then we'd hear a lot of other things that we really would have a hard time discerning when it was fast. So people have done studies actually with video, and they found that in fact the birds are in effect experiencing time at a much faster rate than we as humans. So to me this is like totally fascinating because here we all are in the world, and we're sort of in the world simultaneously, and we're living, and we're doing what we need to do, but we're doing it in very different ways. This is another composition that I made at the time that I was working at the Lab of Ornithology, and it is a collection of sounds because I wanted to let people know that there were all these kinds of sounds available. I'm going to play a small segment of it.
Disithamnus plumbeus, plumbeus ant vireo.
So this is just a collection of sound files. There's no processing of any kind that I've applied to the sound files. I just made a structure for combining them, so sometimes they overlap and sometimes there's only one going on at a time. In 2015-16, I had the good fortune to be able to go to York University in the United Kingdom and work at the Contemporary Music Research Center there. And I had some bioacoustics projects that had to do with trying to kind of recreate the field environment. So can we make a kind of a spatialized version of the sound so it's a sort of surround sound kind of situation? So you can listen to the sounds as if you were where they were being made. So there was a lot of interesting things that I learned. I'm not sure I got anything definitive. But part of what I did was I worked with a group that's not unlike the Evergreen Experimental Music Ensemble. There's a group called The Assembled, and they do these different kinds of collaborative improvisations and other kinds of performances. So I did a piece with them, and it was a little bit of the my motivation for making the current piece that we'll hear a bit later. So here's a short bit of it. I want to turn this up so we get the full effect here. I'm having trouble playing these videos. I don't understand why. Oh, I guess that's not.
Disithamnus plumbeus, plumbeus.
Okay, well, that's okay. We'll just keep going. So I began to become interested in using field recordings and combining them. Oh, there's no sound, but it's working. So I worked on it collaboratively with the ensemble, and we had organized it in terms of animals in a forest environment, animals under the ocean, so water and air, and in terms of a thunderstorm that had happened, and so it was a sort of a programmatic approach to that. So this was as I mentioned before, to become interested in computer control of instrumental sound and combining that with field recordings in some kind of a way. And so at that time then, this is kind of wonderful to watch, I was investigating some pieces that I knew pretty well, which were the sonatas and interludes of John Cage, so he's modifying the instruments, and disclavier. So I had actually recorded some of these piano pieces so that the disclavier, which is essentially a player piano, it's like a digital player piano, and it's a real piano with a computer mechanism in it. So the piano was playing the sonatas and interludes, and I was sort of playing along with it, and that was kind of fun. So I began work at that time then on, there we go, on these two pieces. And this is what I've been working on for the last couple of years or so, sort of focusing on these two entities, one called Hidden Encounters, which is a sound installation, and the other Doubtful Sound. So it's the piece that we will perform later. But what I've been doing is working on these two pieces kind of simultaneously and constructing what I call interim reports. So I'm making a sequence of realizations of each of the projects, And the result so far has been a kind of two parallel families of artworks. And one is this interactive sound installation project, which is called Hidden Encounters, and the other is a composition for a computer system, an instance of which we will hear later on, called Doubtful Sound. So there's a little history behind both of these, and I'd like to just briefly alert you to that. So the project that I worked on when I was working at the Lab of Ornithology, the main thing that I did was to direct the analysis and sort of communication procedure for this set of buoys that recorded whale sounds. So the issue is that the North Atlantic right whale is highly endangered. There's only about 450 of those animals left, and they live in the Atlantic. So one of the biggest problems they have is that they get hit by boats, big gigantic ships. So our lab built these buoys and built the software to be able to recognize a particular one of the sounds that's made by the right whales, and then we were using an interface, and this is still, you can go to that website and see the live data for this set of buoys, which are in the shipping lanes off of Boston Harbor. So this was a really big deal. We called up the ship captains and said, you know, we're hearing these whales here, and it was a new way of monitoring animals using acoustics. So that has influenced a lot of the work that I've done. So one thing I had wanted to do, and I'm still sort of working in that direction, is to somehow bring the voice of the animal into a space where humans find it convenient to go rather than under the water. And then to be able to explore that sound in some way as if, my dream is that it sounds like the animal is trying to talk to you or trying to communicate with you, and then you are trying to communicate with it. So I began this project, which involves a sensor, and the sensor notices your movement. So again, this notion of influence rather than direct control. So this was the first iteration of the project, and I ended up having to have this box here because I wanted it to be hidden encounters. I wanted the idea that you would go into a room and there would be this sound, and you wouldn't know really where the sound was coming from or what, you know, how it was getting made. But that was just way too complicated. So what I did is I have a sensor, which in this case, with this particular first iteration of the project, in fact, when you walked, if you look very carefully over there on the left, to that sort of cat down in the lower right-hand corner of the box, there are, and you'll see more of this later, there's two little holes, and this is where the ultrasonic rangefinder sensor that I was using is located. So basically all you do is walk in front of the box, and then it starts playing, and then it plays the same sound file twice, the first time as it normally is recorded, and the second time at a different rate. But this was a real first step one of trying to realize my project. So it's well, that's what it is. It's a step one. So we can listen to it a little bit. So it's in Cyprus. So there's a lot of actual environmental sound, not synthetic environmental sound, that accompanies my installation. Lots of cars. So that was a first step. So then I had another opportunity to install the next version of this work in Germany at an acoustic ecology conference. And I still had the box, but the box had suffered some wear and tear coming all the way back from Cyprus and then going to Germany. So as you can see on the upper right hand, I started to put these little electronic components on the box. And I was very interested in making a kind of a mysterious situation now that I had the box. I wanted people still to have a sense that the source of the sound was hidden and that they would at least be confused as to where the source of the sound was coming from. But inside the box, you can see down on the on the left-hand side of the screen there, it's an Arduino that I'm using, and then I have the sensor, and I have another picture of that you'll see later. So the electronics is all in the box. And it was quite interesting because it was, I used some machine learning in addition to the just relatively straightforward playback mechanism. And so that introduced quite a delay into the response of how people experienced it. And people got so curious that they actually, I had gone somewhere and I came back and looked at, and someone had taken the top off the box and they had sort of taken things out and they just really wanted to know what was happening, So it was very funny, so I didn't really want that to happen. So I put this sign on the box. But this is a good description of my interest. So it's the installation responding indirectly over time. And its changes are logical, but unpredictable. And to me it was ironic because this was acoustic ecology. This is such an interesting thing that has really become much more of a mainstream kind of activity for people, is sound walks and these kinds of focusing on listening to the sounds of the environment and these kinds of things. It's quite wonderful. So this was a whole collection of these people, and a lot of them had actually been doing this kind of targeted listening for many, many years. But you had to sort of stand in front of the box and kind of move around and listen and take your time and, no, just got to go on to the next activity. So it was quite useful for me to observe how people interacted with the system. So most recently, I installed this yet next version of the piece in a gallery in Kingston, Ontario, affiliated with Queen's University. And here I really wanted to I wanted to work on the interactive part, but I also worked on the sort of synthetic environment. So this is a combination, this installation now is a combination of a kind of synthetic environment, which is very similar to what it is that we are going to hear in this piece that we'll perform shortly, and also a kind of interactive component. So this is the ultrasonic rangefinder, those two little sensors there, and this measures the distance, and so when you walk in front of it, it notices, the computer can easily notice, oh, it's not, the distance has changed, and so then that can be used to control playback and different kinds of things. So this was yet another sort of step in the experimentation process. I tried to make it hidden. It didn't really get hidden very carefully. That's the box that I would carry the other box around in, which is now not being, well, actually that one is being used, but the box from the previous versions became a kind of an artifact that I included in the installation. This is the gallery. It's a lovely space. We had quite a lot of speakers around in the ceiling, plus we had a couple of speakers in the room, and this made a really nice acoustic environment. I have a bit of recording for it, very short. One is the kind of interactive. So this is somebody walking in front of the sensor and kind of moving around. Oh, why are we not playing? Let me try again. Here we go. Let me play that again. So basically, if the sensor were there and this was where it was bouncing off of, I would go like this, and sort of I can kind of dance around. But I was building, you really weren't controlling it, but you thought you were controlling it. So that was another wrinkle. Here's a very short bit of what it sounded like being in the installation. So that was the sound I played before, right at the end. And so ultimately, the next step is to integrate that. But what was interesting to me was, well, now I built something that actually has a sort of potential performative aspect, because someone could do dance or just movement of some kind, however you want to think about it, in conjunction with the kind of synthetic environment that was going on, and actually contribute to that environment through working with the system. So that's where that particular piece is right now. And these are some of the questions that I have been focusing on in terms of this hidden encounters composition. I have to zoom a little bit here. But these are very important. So the processes that we need to undertake in order to try to understand a situation with which we're very unfamiliar. So that goes back to the right whales. Can we talk to the right? What would that be? How would you communicate with a right whale? How does time? What's the importance of time within that kind of coming to understand how to manage an unfamiliar situation, and what kind of strategies might we work with? So here is the other project, which is the Doubtful Sound project, and again, I'm interested in experimenting with these synthetic environments and animal sounds and the computer interaction, and I've now added the notion of network structures as a kind of way of organizing the material. And again, this is an experiment. But this came about because I was interested in the notion of networks, and looking through, there's quite a lot of social network theory that biologists employed. So there's mathematical approaches that you can take to kind of understand the way that a social network functions. And this dolphin population, the person who did this work, David Luceau, he basically was looking at how often different dolphins would interact with each other. So it's very similar to a social network, human social network idea that we're talking about, but he collected this data and did quite a lot of different analysis on it. Another use of networks in sound is George Cacioppo is a composer, mid-20th century composer, who made an early graphic score, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But I want you to get an idea that Doubtful Sound is an actual place. And I just had to call my piece Doubtful Sound because it just seemed like the greatest title. But this is a place in New Zealand, and there's a group of dolphins that live there, and they were the subject of the study. This is the data that I mapped that David Luceau collected. One of the interesting things about this kind of a network is that there are two kinds of interactions that are of interest. I mean, there's many, but there's two basic ones. So the red arrows up in the kind of upper left-hand corner are, you'll notice number 14 is getting a lot of other dolphins connecting to them. So there's a communication, a directed communication towards dolphin number 14. And then if you look down over to the lower right, a little bit lower, number 52 there, 52 is communicating with, so he's sending messages or interacting, initiating interactions with many others. So there's this notion of directed networks. this is the composition, and I have a larger score. So this is one of the first uses of this kind of organizational structure in composition. And so these is generally played on the piano, but there's a lot of variability available within the score. I focused on this part of the network, and in fact, this structure is present in the piece that we're going to perform. It functions as choosing the sound files that we will play. So I have just a little bit of a demo here. So if you start at what's called the brain structure in this piece, you may go to A6, and then you may go back to the brain, or then come out of the brain on the bottom there, or you could go back in, or you could go to E6 2, and then you could continue on. So it's just pathways. So the network structure creates a set of multiple pathways. And so that network structure was built by the composer, whereas in the Doubtful Sound dolphin population, the network structure is determined by the actual data of the interactions. So these are the two networks that combine within the piece right now. So this is, you hear the animal sounds there, and also that player piano, and also my own playing. So just quickly, we're almost done here. This was last January. I was able to go to Chicago, and I basically used the same kind of computer-controlled sound file playback system with a xylophone. And we can listen to just the tiniest bit of that so you can hear. So I did a lot of different things, but one of the things that I did was I bowed the end there, which is quite a nice effect. So most recently, I did a performance again in Ontario of this piece, this time in a grand piano, using a grand piano and a kind of a sort of a structured improvisation I made for myself. And this is a really beautiful room that I was able to perform in. And again, you can hear just a snippet of what I was able to do. So some of the sounds are becoming a little bit familiar, at least to me. So that's basically where we are now. And so this is the slide we look at the beginning. And I hope you've gotten a little bit of a sense of the background that I'm coming from for this piece that we're going to perform now. So I just wanted to introduce the players, and maybe we want to start coming up. We have Callum McKean playing trombone, Emma Jones, voice, Shirley Ehrman, violin, Elliot Kennedy, banjo, Dan Stein, bass, Charlie Tam, percussion, and Ben Kapp, cello. anyone have any questions?
So I noticed the visual representations of sound you included in the slideshow, and I was wondering what those visual representations told you and how you use them, if you use them at all in your projects.
So which ones were you thinking of?
There was like different graphs of the sound files.
The spectrograms?
Yeah,
that-
yeah, those sort of.
Do I use those? I've done a lot of work with them because that's basically the way that we're doing a lot of the identification of sounds, and people do, is look at the shape that those spectrograms can show. In my music, I don't think I really have used them much, no.
Thank you.
Do you have an ultimate goal? Are you trying to continue to make art, or are you trying to help find ways to better understand nature and to help the process of keeping endangered animals alive?
I think there's an argument to say that those can be similar things. And I think part of what I'm trying to explore through this work is a notion of understanding. As I'm emphasizing this idea of unfamiliarity, it seems to me that our biggest problem is ourselves as humans. And if we can't talk to each other and understand each other, then we have difficulties. But the animals are sort of magnify that difference that we have among ourselves. And so exploring the kind of really very different kinds of sounds that animals are making, and we don't know what that meaning is, and this kind of thing, it seems to me to be a way to work. But more directly, I am interested in continuing to try to work on installations that will bring for example, the right whales. If you go to a place and there are right whale sounds, then maybe you didn't know about right whales, and now you know about right whales, and this is a useful thing. So then when people are trying to pass legislation, you'll be a little bit informed about that being a significant problem. So that's one thing. And I do still do some of the kind of analysis work that I did before as a freelance person, and that is mostly what that work is trying to identify where the animals are and who is there, which species are there in any given area, and just collecting information about that so that we know that if we're going to be attempting to work in an area, or then we know if we've encountered species that we need to be careful of, and so on. So there is a sort of a scientific component that continues. That's helpful.
So you said in your talk something about like the difference in time that different animals might experience, and how you were trying to like use sound to make it, to maybe put it in the same time flow of people. But I was wondering, like, how do you use time in your music? Like, do you try to slow people down or make us think about time in a different way or something?
I am interested in people listening. And sometimes that means slowing things down. That's true, yeah. But I'm trying to build a system that is unpredictable in terms of the timing. So I've spent quite a lot of time, so to speak, devising ways to make the situation so that although you may know the collection of sounds that are involved in the piece, you won't really be able to find any patterns in terms of when certain sounds occur. And the reason for doing that is that if you're in a kind of an improvisational situation, then that unexpectedness can allow you to respond in ways that you might not otherwise, and that can have a useful outcome.
So in this iteration of that we just heard, this iteration of the piece, we heard, what I thought I heard was recognizable animal sounds at the beginning, and then those went away, and then I didn't recognize anything that I would say that's an animal sound later. Is that typical of this system?
That's an interesting observation, because it's hard for me to know what recognizing an animal sound is really. But I think, to answer the question, my interest, and I think we did a very nice job of it, or the group did, of sort of this merging between the sounds that were being made acoustically on the instruments and the sounds that the computer was generating. So there was kind of a ambiguity in terms of the actual source of the sound, and to me that becomes an interesting situation, because then it's not so much about the source of the sound, it's a little bit more about the character of the sound itself.
I think, can I talk? I'm a visual artist and a sculptor, and I'm wondering how you think about, I'm over here.
Sorry, I can't really see very well.
I'm wondering how you think about space in your work, and whether, are your audiences always passive, or are they moving in the space? Or do you think about designing spaces with auditory spaces? That's part of my question. Then I'm thinking, since you're into biology, I'm thinking about this idea of species niche, and the idea that there are sort of optimal conditions and spaces where different species can exist. Do you think sound is part of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I do think that animals are using the environment in which they live, and so bioacoustics is very much, some of its central questions are why does this animal make this kind of signal as opposed to another kind, and a lot has to do with where they live and how they can effectively communicate within the actual environment. So of course, if you're in the ocean, sound travels faster in the ocean. So that means that the same loudness of sound will go farther in the ocean than it would in the air. And so that influences this whale communications. The animals are able to communicate over much larger distances. But in terms of my own work, I think I have, when I was working at the Lab of Ornithology, I was pretty much working at the Lab of Ornithology, so I didn't do a lot of musical work except a few pieces that I showed a little bit about. But certainly the notion of space has become very important to me from working there, because I realized just what I was talking about, how the space, the environment in which an animal lives affects the way the animal behaves. But I am very much interested in the notion of propagation and processing that the environment does to a sound, and that's where my next interest lies, is investigating that. And also I think that in the kind of work I've done now, there's two things. One is that, in a sense, with a piece like what we just did, there's a sort of space equals time kind of situation. So I'm interested in creating a situation where there can be a sort of balance of time, so to speak. I don't exactly know what that means, but that that the lengths of sounds, the length of time of a specific sound, kind of corresponds to the kind of spatial sensibility that that sound has in terms of the way it occupies a space. The other thing is that the Hidden Encounters installation is very much a spatial composition. And so the last version of it that I showed in the gallery, people were just coming and walking through and also triggering the sort of elementary kind of interaction. So that's another area to explore, is that spatial aspect, but I haven't gotten as far as I might yet.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious if the interaction between human and computer concept and the sort of biomimicry that's going on, I'm curious if you're interested in seeing that applied to different mediums beyond sound, visual maybe, or something else.
That's a really interesting thing. I don't think I've thought about that really. I think that what I've been thinking about with the sound, and the initial idea about this I had with that piece that I did in the UK, that ensemble piece, was that, and some of the instructions for the group here include this kind of an idea too, which is not so much an imitation of the sound, but rather an exploration of the sound. So the idea is, well, especially if you have an instrument, you know, you could make a sound on that instrument depending on what the sound is that you're interested in imitating. You can do that actually depending on the instrument and the sound. You can really probably do that really well if you wanted to. But my interest was, you know, the idea that yes, you can do that, but what's the limit of that? So if you if you have a sound and you play it really, really high, but it actually is low, how does that, does that, how far up do you have to go before it becomes something else? Like if that was what I was, so of course that varies with the instrument and with the sound itself, but it's a sort of an exploration of the limits of what the animal is actually working with in terms of a sound. But I could also see that, you know, you could take the same kind of an idea of this sort of exploration of particular movements of animals, or any kind of visual, you know, painting or animation or something like that. That could be very interesting, and it might be interesting to integrate that with the sound.
Thank you.
So for your Hidden Encounters presentation, what drove your, what did you do to determine how you wanted to visually represent that? Because I noticed you had the little masks of the animals and stuff. Why did you choose that over some other expression?
And that was a very practical choice. So when I was in Cyprus and I was working on that very first iteration, I realized I had gotten I had wanted to take that Arduino and put it up high somewhere where people wouldn't be able to see it. But that was not possible. And I have been, for a while now, I have a computer that is about this big, you know, one of these, it's called a Bella. It's sort of optimized for sound, but it's one of those tiny little computers similar to an Arduino. And my goal is to put the whole program, what we've got here, onto that small computer so I can hide it better. So I couldn't hide the computer, so I had to get a box. And so I was wandering around Cyprus, and there's a carnival there every year. So those are carnival mask images, and it seemed to kind of work, given sort of expediting the situation.
Hi. I'm interested in the human-to-human interaction in your composition, in particular, the composer-to-performer interaction. And what kind of instruction did you provide the performers, and what kind of feedback did they give to you as a composer?
Yes, I'm very interested in that aspect, and I haven't done a lot of work, really, with that. So I really am really only thinking of two situations, and that is what we've been working on here, and then the version of the piece that I did in the UK. And for both of those, I had written out a kind of a set of instructions, but they didn't really include the computer system. So because we started out, the group here, we started out with developing an improvisation that was sort of collectively determined by the group, and I wasn't here. I was not in residence. So they were working on their own from these ideas that I had developed that were related to the ideas that I developed with the group in the UK. So I think that's quite fruitful. It allows a composer to sort of pose some questions and sort of pose a situation that can be explored. But I think that as we then started working with the computer system, it became clear that we should go on and have instructions concerning that and have a way to talk about that. So I'm learning. Thank you.
Your interaction, what was it like to try to improvise to natural sounds or to recorded? You don't have to, but if you do.
Maybe if she looks before we
I will just say that it was extremely fun to interact with each other and basically have this. We kind of set it up where we kind of had a day in the life of our animals. We picked an animal to represent our instrument. I'm kind of like giving up what we did. But then we had certain sounds that signified a shift in the day. So there was hyena laughter, and that was a midday shift. And then there was a frog croak feedback, and that was the shift into nighttime. And there would be different. We thought about our animals and what would our animals be doing in that certain time of day, but also trying to form duets and different interactions with the other animals. Like if I was a rat, and if I interacted with a different animal, how would that sound? And it was a whole day in the life of being an animal and interacting with each other, and it felt very real when we did it, when we felt like we were doing it correctly. Yeah.
Thank you.